you're in good company. Most of the country doesn't. It's over near Tamworth, about 30 k's out of Tamworth. And I'm representing the Centre for Rural Local Government today. We're going to look at 16 years of rural local government revenue and expenditure trends. And I think you'll be quite surprised at what's been happening. And if you're sitting there in your council thinking, oh, things are going downhill for us, this might come some way towards explaining why that's happening. Before I proceed on to the slides, and before I forget, can I let everyone know that on Friday, the 15th of May, we will be having a special session on co-hosted with the University of New England on the amalgamations. It's 10 years on from the amalgamations. So if you're in any state and you want to know how amalgamations turn out, that's the session to turn up to. Emeritus Professor Brian Dollery will MC the event and introduce the event. Then I'll speak for a little while, and then we'll have a mayor from an amalgamated council to tell you what it was like on the ground. So let's get to today's session though. We're going to look through these graphs, and there's quite a few, but I've simplified them as much as possible, and I'll talk for about half the time. And then after that, you'll hear from a general manager on the ground who will actually tell you what it all means in the real world. Of course, as scholars, we look at things in aggregate, macro trends, but we don't know what's happening day in, day out in your particular local government. So that'll be very helpful to have David Webb join us in the second half and explain what I've been talking about. So we're going to look at some graphs, and hopefully you can see the first one in front of you. Now, what we're looking at is year-on-year percentage changes to revenue, expenditure, and then various parts of revenue and expenditure. And you'll see in this case, I've plotted 3 lines or 4 lines if you count the dotty line. The most interesting line for most of you will be the mean or the average. Add up all the number, divide by the number of numbers, that's the average. And that's what is usually a decent measure of typical outcomes. But you've got to get an idea of the spread as well. So to give you an idea of the spread, I've plotted in quartile 1, 25% of councils are below quartile 1. That's the dark blue line on this slide. And quartile 3, 25% of the councils are above quartile 3. So when the mean's in the middle of quartile 1 and quartile 3, it means that the mean's a really good measure of the middle. But it's also nice to know and helpful to know how far either side of the middle lots of councils are doing. And you can see this revenue data, as I say, remind you, percentage year-on-year changes, and it's for New South Wales rural local governments, but they all have similar trends. You can see this line goes back 16 years from 2010. The first thing you'll probably notice is that the revenue does go up and down, and it's been going up and down in response mostly to stimulus programs put out by state governments and federal governments. That's a big part of it, and also the prepayment of our main sources of grants. The other thing you'll notice about it is I put in a trend line, that's the dotty line there, and you can see it's heading uphill. It typically sits around the 5 to 6% mark, and that's good if your expenses are typically around the 5 or 6% mark. You'll notice in 2025, it absolutely fell off a cliff, and there's a good reason for that, and I'm sure David will tell you, has to do with the grant payments. But certainly since 2023, it has been going downhill very steeply, which is something I've been concerned about for a while, that people weren't going to be aware of that. 2025 year-on-year growth in local government revenue for bush councils was actually negative 10%. So you didn't grow, you went backwards. Okay, the next graph compares rural versus urban revenue. So in this graph, and I'm just looking at the averages this time, or there'd be too many lines. In this graph, you can see what happens to the urban councils, the purple lines, compared to what happens to the rural councils, the light blue line. And you can see over recent years, rural councils have been growing their revenue a bit faster than urban councils, which is good. But in the last 2 years in particular, rural councils, bush councils have suffered much more so than urban councils. And a lot of that has to do with the grant tap the timing of the grants and the grant tap being turned off, urban councils have lots of other sources of revenue that bush councils don't just have. So when there's changes to grants, it doesn't affect urban councils as much as it does bush councils. And take note of 2025, your typical bush councils revenue went down by 10%, which is certainly not a good outcome. Now let's start having a look at some of the components of the revenue. And a big component of the revenue is what we call operating grants. So people that aren't inside local government, they're mainly what we call the financial assistance grants, money that comes from the federal government via state governments to local governments. But there's also other operating grants directly from local government. And these are typically untied monies. So these are the monies we like because we can spend it on what we need to spend it on, fixing potholes, paying staff, things like this. So now we're just looking at rural councils, and we've gone back to having a mean, the dark green line, a quartile 1, 25% of councils below that, a quartile 3, 25% of councils above that. And you can see the grants are all over the place. They have great big bumps up, and then they have great big dives down. And that would present an awful lot of challenges to general managers and councillors trying to manage budgets when your grants are going up and down like a yo-yo. So that's one thing to notice. Number two thing to notice is 2023 operating grants hit a bit of a high. They were growing very, very strongly. 2024 financial year, negative. 2025 financial year, extremely negative about the timing of the payments of the grants. This puts a lot of uncertainty into budget. So if you're not inside local government and you're wondering why council might have missed the budget, I think that particular graph might give you a lot of reasons why that might have happened. Now let's look at the other source of grants, which is the capital grants. So this is when state or federal government gives you money to build a particular thing, and by law you must spend the money on the thing you were given it to build. And it's always been chaotic and always will be. There's large peaks and there's very large troughs as well. And a lot of that's to do with stimulus programs. You'll see it's a shorter period of time here. I didn't have the data going back prior to 2014. Shorter period of time. You'll see though, if you look at the trend line, the dotted line, it has been downhill over that period. And you can see that it peaked in 2023, well, actually peaked in 2018. There was another minor peak in 2021. And since 2023, it's been going downhill. 2025, it was 0. 20 for the typical average council. 2025 for the Q1 councils, it was very, very, very negative. So part of that is there was a lot of capital grants money in the period directly after COVID, and that has been spent, and that funding, that grant tap has been turned off like I suggested it always would be, and we're now seeing that flow through. The problem is that for a long period of time, a lot of councils have got used to there being strong flows of grants, capital grants in particular, and I would suggest to you those times are probably over. State governments and federal governments have their own sustainability woes. If you're wondering and worried about your own sustainability, go and look at the forward projections for the federal government and you'll have lots to worry about. Now, one of the easiest things for state and federal governments to do to help repair their budgets at the margins is to turn off this capital grants tap, because most people in the community aren't aware that the state government and federal government give you money to build things sometimes. So suddenly stopping that isn't going to give you a great big political backlash, particularly if it's in little rural bush councils, which is where it's been stopping, because there's just not many voters in the bush, which is why we get what we get in the bush. So this should be a real concern to people. Now let's have a look at the expenditure side. So you'll recall that on the revenue side, things were negative last year. The year before, they were almost 0. Have a look at this. Dark green line is your average again. What has been happening in expenditure? Well, it has been going down in recent years, but in 2025, the typical expenditure went up 5%. Remember, the typical revenue went down 10%. 2024, the typical expenditure went up about 6.5%. Remember, in that particular financial year, the typical revenue was flat at 0%. So these are really, really big problems. Your revenue year-on-year growth is going down and sometimes backwards, but your expenditure year-on-year growth is still very high. Massive spike in 2023 when a lot of that post-COVID money was hitting the ground and you had to build things and no one could get contractors or staff or anything else. The other thing that I'd like you to notice here is the dotted line. I think most fair-minded people would say prior to 2020, the year-on-year expenditure growth was about 3-4%. It was a bit spiky and lumpy, but it was around the 3-4% mark. Since 2020, we've hit a much higher new year-on-year expenditure growth level. It's around the 5 and a bit percent now. And what I'm worried about is that we're not going back to where we were back in the period 2013 to 2016 when things were pretty good. So that's a concern. Now let's have a look at the difference between typical rural expenditure growth and typical urban expenditure growth. And what you'll see is that in recent years, the rural year-on-year percentage increase in expenditure is considerably higher than urban. Why does that happen? Well, it's exactly what we would expect in a high inflation environment where inflation is hitting energy costs. Everything we get in the bush gets trucked to us or flown to us. And when you have a high inflation environment, particularly at the energy level, that's going to reflect in much higher costs for bush councils than what it does for their city counterparts who don't have to pay those transport costs. The other really interesting thing too that explains why rural councils' growth in expenditure often outstrips urban councils is that bush councils typically do a lot more than urban councils, certainly in New South Wales. So bush councils in New South Wales will tend to do water and sewer as well, and run Services New South Wales, which is a state government agency for them, and contracts for the RTA and things like that. So because we're doing more varied stuff, when inflation hits, it's going to hit us comparatively more than what it does for our city cousins. Now let's have a look at the three big components of expenditure: staff, depreciation, and materials and contracts. So look first at staff. So once again, you've got the average there. It's a dark green line. Quartile 1, 25% of councils are below that. The dark blue line. Quartile 3, 25% of councils above that line. I've put it in also a dotted trend line. You can see that staff costs year-on-year percentage growth is actually increasing. Now that's a real challenge for bush councils. Now, obviously staff costs are going to increase even if you didn't increase staff numbers, because most people in Australia get an enterprise bargaining agreement increase most years. I think it was 3%, 3.5% the last couple years. So that explains part of that growth, but obviously something else is happening here. So we used to have staff growth, between the 3 and 4% mark. Since 2023, percentage growth in staff costs has been above 6%. Last financial year, it was above 8%. That's what the typical council's doing. Now, obviously, that's going to put a big strain on budgets, particularly when, remember that revenue graph? 2025, it was negative. 2024, it was 0, yet your staff costs have been increasing by 6, 7, 8% during that period of time. So Clearly, there's an increase in staff numbers. Also, I'm well aware that a lot of councils in the bush are having to pay more to get people with certain skills to come out and work. Plus, there was a skill shortage, a massive skill shortage as a result of the COVID era and the COVID stimulus that accompanied the COVID era, and that also is forcing up costs. So that's staff costs. They're well above revenue. And for those of you in New South Wales, you'll be well aware that staff costs growing at 6, 7, 8% per year is way, way more than your rate cap, which during that period has been 2, 3, 4%. So that's a problem. Now let's look at materials and contracts. So they're things like your electricity bills, your fuel costs, your insurance costs, when you have to subcontract or contract, bring in contractors to do work, things like this. Now, as you would expect, they are very lumpy. A lot of that follows capital spends. So it's a little bit hard to draw conclusions there, other than the fact that it has been lumpy, which makes it very difficult to manage budgets. Fortunately, we have headed downhill since the massive peak in 2023 of over the typical council, around the 34% growth in materials and contract expenses. That's not sustainable. You can't put up your rates 34% every year. So I'm glad we headed downhill and we're approaching zero, which is great. But spare a thought for the quartile 3 councils, there's still 12% growth in the last financial year. Now, there's no way any of your revenue is keeping up with that. So that's a real challenge for financial sustainability. Now let's have a look at depreciation. So for people that aren't in the finance field or aren't local government insiders, depreciation works like this. In the olden days, in the cash accounting days, if I built a bridge for $1 million and it was going to last 10 years, in the particular year that I built the bridge, I would still expense $1 million. Since depreciation, called accrual accounting, came in, instead of expensing the whole $1 million when I spend it, I say, well, that bridge is lasting 10 years, $100,000 per year I'll expense, and that'll come to roughly to the same amount. And it's a better reflection of how the bridge is being consumed over time. Now, that's obviously an oversimplified version of depreciation. For all the accounting people out there, don't get too angry with me, but no one wants all the detail of AASB 116. But that's basically how it works. Now, there's some states where they're trying to sideline depreciation. I know Queensland's having issues with this, New South Wales is having issues with this, and there's a lot of people, including a lot of councillors, who don't think it's a real thing or don't quite understand it, because in the private world, if you're a farmer or businessman, if you have depreciation, it's an awesome thing because you get to claim the tax deduction and you get some money back. But in local government, it's not an awesome thing at all, and it makes it very challenging for us to balance budgets. Now, since the amalgamations in 2017, as you can see from the average line, the dark green line there, depreciation year-on-year percentage changes went up substantially, and they've been trending upwards every year since then. Now, a couple of things happened. Prior to amalgamations, some local governments had some interesting useful lives and depreciation accrual schedules that had to be corrected. We also had central auditor coming in New South Wales, and the central auditor had some interesting ideas about what assets councils did and did not control. And also, I've shown in the scholarly work that they've gone towards standardising the useful life of assets, which is what underpins depreciation, and that has worked rather badly for a lot of councils in the bush in particular. So to show you why this is a problem, in 2025 financial year, the average council's depreciation went up 8%. 2024, the average council went up about 7%. That's growing a lot faster than your revenue. Now, It's not just about central auditing. It's not just about fixing things that mightn't have been done terribly well in the past. It's also about fair value revaluations, which are reflective of the current cost of doing things, and everyone knows costs are going up. And it's also about, remember all those capital grants we talked about before to build stuff after COVID? Well, guess what? Once you've built the stuff, you get to expense the depreciation associated with that stuff forevermore. It increases your unit cost forever. And that's part of what we're seeing here too. So I expect this depreciation to continue to grow and to continue to grow at a rate that is far faster than your revenue, which is going to continue to put a lot of difficulties for you in balancing budgets. Depreciation, usually roughly a third of your expenditure. It depends on your particular council, of course. So this is a big deal when you have depreciation growing so fast. Now, one of the effects, we're almost at the end of my slides, one of the effects of revenue growing more slowly than expenditure, and in fact, remember revenue in the last year was negative, one of the effects of that is you'll see a rundown in cash. Now, we've got 3 pockets of cash in New South Wales: externally restricted cash, developer contributions, and capital grants that you can't touch; internally restricted cash, which is reserved for important things and can only be released via a council resolution; and unrestricted cash. Now, there's no point looking at unrestricted cash because it goes up and down like a yo-yo. Percentage changes off very low bases give you astronomical numbers. What I found over decades of working with councils that had big financial sustainability problems is one of the first signs of difficulties for councils is the rundown in the internal cash, or internal cash not growing at a rate commensurate with local government inflation. So ideally, internal cash is for things like plant and equipment replacement and things like that. Internal cash should be growing every year at 3, 4, 5%. So it's a real problem. If you have a look at this graph, it does indicate that the stress that I'm suggesting is happening out there in the sector is happening, because the typical council in New South Wales, the internal cash didn't grow at all in 2024. In 2025, it went down by about 6%. That's a problem. That's the typical council. Q1 councils, in 2024, it was -7%. 2023, it was -1%. 2025, it was -23%. So they're the councils that are probably under an awful lot of stress. It could be they've had to replace some equipment, but when you're looking at things in aggregate and you're seeing lines go down like that, you know that this is one of the early signs of distress. And that's what I've found over many years working with councils. Now, this is the very last slide I'll show you, but it's really, really important. We have rate capping in New South Wales, and the cap is set at what is supposed to represent the inflation that local governments are feeling. Now, one of the big inputs that's used to come up with that cap is CPI, the Consumer Price Index. It's the wrong input. It's as simple as that. There's no nice way of saying it. The Consumer Price Index measures the decrease in the value of a consumer dollar when they're buying things. That's what inflation's all about. Now, the things that consumers buy, popcorn, bananas, movie tickets, are not the things that I hope your local government's buying. So it has no relevance to local government costs. But even if it did, I don't know about you guys, but I hear the inflation rate. So last inflation rate we were told was 3.8%. And if you're anything like me, you say a word you probably shouldn't say and go, yep, that's not what I'm feeling in my life. Because inflation isn't the only part of the story. Inflation is measuring how much more it costs you to buy the same basket of goods. But there's a different thing called the cost of living index, which measures the confluence of how much extra it costs you to buy the same basket of goods, plus all the new things you are now buying that you didn't have to use to buy. So if I talk about my personal budget, I have inflation, but I'm also noticing there's a whole heap of things I never used to have to buy that I have to buy. So now I pay the New South Wales state government $110 per year not to teach. Previously, to not teach and have my teacher's license, it cost me zero. Now it cost me $110, so that's a new cost. My email addresses. Previously, iiNet gave them to me for free. Now I'm being charged $75 per email address. So it's all those new extra things, as well as the inflation, which gets me to the cost of living index, which is why when I hear the 3.8%, I don't believe it. Now, it's much the same deal for local governments. And I always work with this assumption. It is reasonable to think that what is reasonable for your particular council is what other councils are typically doing. That would be a cost of living index for local government. So with respect to what we've just been looking at, if we looked at the average percentage year on year change in expenditure, that would give us the cost of living for a local government. That's the grey line there. And you can see the grey line is way, way, way higher than the rate cap, which is the blue line. Now, in the last 3 financial years, it's been slightly different for councils, depending on your population factor, but most bush councils aren't growing, so most of you will be in that situation. Cost of living is far higher than the rate cap. Now, what about inflation, I hear you say? Well, I could use the local government cost index, but I just finished telling you that it's not a very good index because one of the main components is CPI, and it's entirely the wrong number to be sticking in there. So if I had to look at something, a pre-made index that could measure inflation a little bit, I would look at what's called the producer price index. So this is inflation for businesses essentially. And the sub-index I would be looking at is the producer price index for roads in the state of New South Wales. So it doesn't matter if it's a council building, a private person, federal government or state government, this is how the cost for building roads has gone up. Why would I look at PPI roads? Well, that's the biggest single thing local governments do. So that gives you an idea of inflation. And you can see that in most years, the cost of living index, our grey line, way higher than the inflation index. So if you have a rate cap that's only keeping up with inflation, you will become unsustainable for sure because you're doing extra stuff. Keeping up with inflation's not enough, is it? You've got to keep up with your actual cost of living, which is the grey line. But even if we wanted the rate, even if we wanted to have the story that the rate cap was keeping up with inflation, if you look at the PPI roads, you can see that certainly over recent years, it hasn't come within cooey of inflation. So that's it for me. There will be time at the end for questions. I'm going to stop sharing and Dave is going to start sharing and he's going to tell you about the interesting things that it means for real people in the real world.
Professor Drew, always very enlightening and interesting. Before I share my screen, I'll just introduce myself, David Webb. I'm the General Manager here at Hay Shire Council. I am joined online by my esteemed Mayor, Carol Ottaway, somewhere. I think she was there, so which is great to have her here. So Hay is in southwestern New South Wales. We're a small rural council. We're about 2,900 people, almost 12,000 square kilometres. We have about 1,800 rating assessments, so we're pretty small from terms of a rating. Our rating comes around about $3 million or just a touch under. We've got a relatively small road network, only 950 kilometres. So for a rural council, that is a huge impact because our financial assistance grants and other funding is based on part of that's on your road length. So our funding model from that is not as strong as a lot of other rural councils with a long road network. And we also are local water utility, so we deliver water and sewer as well as deliver aged care services. We don't have an aged care facility, but we do home support and Meals on Wheels and community transport. And we also support things like the local general practitioners or GPs. That costs us about $120,000 a year to try and keep doctors in town, which is not really a remit for local government, but that's what usually ends up happening. So I'll try and share my screen and see if I can get this right. Hopefully you can see that now. Yep. Can you see that, Professor Drew?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. I'll just start it from the slideshow. Beautiful. Okay, so as I said, we're a small rural council, but what we're seeing is exactly what Professor Drew has just been talking about. We are seeing our operating performance is deteriorating over the last 3 years. So this year we're looking at minus 20%. Before it was forecasted 2 years ago at minus 10. So we're seeing $1 million deterioration. And that's for a number of reasons. So overall, last 3 years, we've seen our operating result decline from -5 to -22, which is, on the scheme of things, would be alarming, which it is. However, there is a number of factors for that which we can manage. First of all, the financial assistance grants the prepayment was 85%. It's now been reduced back to 50. So there's a significant increase in terms of that money that's coming in and when we account for that. The way the auditors are now treating our grant income, Professor Drew will be interested in this, is if they don't believe when they read our grant funding agreements that it's clear when we were going to spend the money, then they account for it the year that we receive it, even though we might not expend it to the following financial year. And that's the way they're making it. So that makes your financial assistance, makes your operating result look terrible for the following year. And obviously rate capping in a very high inflation environment is also not assisting with that. So our rates and charges are about 33% of our income. Our financial assistance grants is about 38% of our income. And our total external grants is about 70% of our revenue, but 80% of our capital is funded externally. And that is probably not unusual for a council in a rural area of our size. So we're finding increasingly dependent on grants while cost growth consistently outpaces our rate peg. And that's what Professor Drew just showed with all his information. And as he just mentioned before, I agree that staff depreciation and materials and contractors are our three biggest expenses. Now, for context, our rate peak for this upcoming year, 26-27, will generate an additional 139,000 in income, but our staffing costs will increase 300,000. So we're just going backwards just on staff costs alone. So each year that structural gap widens. So just on the employee costs, 50%. So the employee costs are about 50% of our operating expenditure. Wages growth, as Professor Drew mentioned in his graphs, was 5% in 2023, while our rate peak was 3.7. And as I mentioned, the rate income is less than 40% of the total revenue. So rate peak does not cover our annual staff costs, and that's just going to keep getting worse and worse, as we saw since COVID. That is you've really seen that change in terms of our employee costs way outstripping any rate increase. The inflation, obviously, input cost escalation as well, as Professor Drew mentioned, electricity, chemicals, contractors, materials, fuel and insurance. Well, fuel's very topical. We haven't seen that personally at council here at the moment. However, we will see that with the cost of inputs, with all the other inputs that rely on transport or some sort of electricity, are going to see our inputs increase more. So inflation is forecasted to go above 4%. Interest rates have just been bumped up 0.25 today. While that doesn't affect us directly, again, it does indirectly affect the cost of our input. So as our costs rise continuously, revenue is fixed annually, and that is going to be an ongoing thing that we need to manage moving forward. And again, Professor Drew's tracking of that over the last 10 years certainly shows that. But the last 2 to 3 years, we've really seen the pinch really feel on councils. And he talked about depreciation, and you can see here in 2018, our asset base base was 86 million, is now 247 million. So depreciation has grown from 3 million to over 5. So that's increased 2 million annually in that time. And that just hits our bottom line when we've got a $15 million small council with about 60 staff and $15 million budget. When you increase that by 2 million, that really shows significant on your operating result, hence why the sharp decline. As Professor Drew mentioned, we've seen a change in the methodology of accounting for depreciation, going from the cash to accrual. That's really impacted, and they are making us index our depreciation every year, even though we might not have necessary, that cost to renew has changed proportionally, but that's what they make us do these days. Hence why one of the reasons why our depreciation has increased so much, as well as we've been influenced by a large capital expenditure over the last 5-6 years. As mentioned, that we've had a lot of capital grants, that we've done a lot of building or renewals or upgrades, but that comes back to hit our depreciation on that operating result. So as we can see, we're around about 1.8 million going to be short for the 25-26 budget. So it's about 12% of that. So that's what we're looking at. And unfortunately, it's not going to be so much of a cash issue for us, which is the main, very important to understand. It's not going to affect our cash position, but overall, it is going to affect our asset renewals down the track. Just my last slide too. So what we must change, finance sustainability for rural councils requires structural reform, not short-term measures. So we need to address cost shifting, and I think the Council of New South Wales would understand that. We need to make sure that we recognition of the rural services cost more for us to deliver, as Professor Drew showed with his index. And a great alignment of service delivery expectations and funding. What does the government expect us to deliver? Why are we helping with deliver doctors' services when we're not involved in the health? Financial assistance grants reform. We're a strong advocate for redistribution of the financial assistance grants. A couple of years ago, the 10 biggest councils in Sydney, metro councils, were receiving $100 million in financial assistance grants. And you pick, they got $350 million budgets, and they get 3 times the amount of grant funding that we get here in Hay, which is not more proportional to the horizontal fiscal equalisation that it should be involved with. So that's something that we've been strongly advocating. I think we're starting to get a little bit of traction around that. We'd also like to see protection of prepayment reductions and greater funding certainty of some of the programs moving forward. We've got an issue in Hay where the regional roads local repair program, or whatever they called it at that time, is dropping off the cliff in another 18 months, but the state government have got no plan or thought at this stage, despite our advocacy, to what they're going to replace that. So we're going to have a road funding shortfall coming up in another 18 months' time that we're trying to get an answer for. And rate peg reform, flexibility to reflect wage growth and inflation. As Professor Drew mentioned, we're still, even though they've reformed the rate structure and they got some about population, it still doesn't reflect exactly where we are in terms of our cost increase versus the rate. So we've got 4.8% for next year, which is probably the highest we've had for a long time, but we can see our costs are still going up 8, 9, 10% across the board. So we're falling behind every year. We can't catch up. So we need to try and keep advocating to the government for that. So what are we doing here? We're not looking at an SRV. Our community couldn't afford it if we wanted to. So we need to make other changes of what we're trying to do for the moment. We want to improve our staff capacity and skills. So we want to do more tight cost control and operation efficiency. We need to get better at what we're doing. We don't have a lot of skin on the bone, but we have had a turnover of staff, and we've got some new staff, and we need to bring them up to a higher level of ability, particularly around cost control and understanding what our costs are. So we're doing a lot of focus on that at the moment. Reviewing our fees and charges, we are way under on the fees and charges, so we need to try and align that more to our costs to provide that services, and we've been discussing that with council recently. More work on the asset management plans and linking to the long-term financial plan, particularly around managing depreciation and capital renewal. At the moment, our capital renewal ratio is around 50% moving forward. That's way too low. I think it's more realistically should be around 80%. Theoretically, it should be 100% above, but that's unrealistic for a small council like us. So we're going to target around 80% because we will rely on some capital grants for some asset renewal. Plus, there's probably some assets we have that we wouldn't renew if they did render their useful life. And realistically, your museums and other sorts of things, you wouldn't do anything with those, and you could realistically say that, well, we'll close that or get rid of that if we got to that point. So I think 80% is probably a realistic target for something like a council of our size. We want to build our cash reserves to 20% operating revenue. We're around about that at the moment, but we want to build a few more dollars in the tin for a rainy day, so to speak. And Professor Drew will love this one, community education about our financial realities. So we need to spend a lot of time on that. The community keep thinking that we should be providing everything for free. As I keep explaining to them, nothing's for free. Someone's paying somewhere. So we need to do a lot more around that, more strategic prioritization of services and capital works in terms of more business cases, and if they're very short, very small, about before we go and get a grant, let's have a look at what that means long term. Is there a tail that's going to come and sting us in terms of a cost? And again, obviously around redistribution of financial assistance grants, that's a big one for us. If we can keep getting the government to send the money where the most need is, and the small rural councils like Hay is a classic case of that. I'm happy to have any questions. That's what we're doing here in Hay, and it is really, really tricky environment at the moment that we're living in, and it's only getting worse each year, and we're really seeing the deterioration of how things are. So we would, it's very challenging at the moment, and Professor Drew's numbers back up that from what we're seeing here on the ground. It's just getting harder and harder to make the two ends meet, and although we're in a strong position and we've got cash and we can ride this out, but we got to make changes in the medium to long term, and I'm sure every rural council's in the same position. So I'm happy to have any questions or any feedback. Thank you.
So thank you very much, David, firstly. Anyone can direct any questions. If we can just go one at a time, it's a bit hard for me to see who's on the screen. So just make sure you're not talking while someone else is talking. Tell us who you want you're directing the question to, whether it's me or David, and we'll do our best to give you an answer. Don't be shy, otherwise we'll be sitting here thinking that everyone got bored to sleep.
Well, that was an awesome presentation.
Yep, I see a hand up from Bradley Burns, so please go.
Here we go. Hey, Brad.
G'day, Dave. I didn't want to leave you hanging, mate. I thought I'd throw a Dorothy Dixer over.
Don't make it too tricky.
Well, it's just an observation. I try to work at this forensically, and you've pointed out back to 2020. Sadly, my career started as a general manager in 2019, so you can go root cause, and my graphs probably they correlate. I don't know whether that means it's right or not. But I'm just wondering, mate. I think there must be some villain in here around asset management, in as far as rural councils. Hay Council's been operating for 200 years. All our shires have been operating, and they've had their varying degrees of viability, but they've produced roads for better or worse that have got our people around. Mm-hmm. But all of a sudden, in the modern era, in the last, say, 15 years or so, it's become a diabolical problem. We all know our engineers ran around a long time trying to make our assets look worse because they were convinced that that would get funding from some magical source to make them look better. And equally then financially now, every year we find a new way of better assessing the value of asset and going down that hole. I just wonder, on a real macro level, if you look back at over time when we've changed what we do hasn't changed for a couple of hundred years in a lot of ways. We have taken on services that we shouldn't do, like health, but basically we were still providing pools and all those things. But it just seems to be something's gone awry with the science about how we're approaching this, and that we're actually convincing ourselves that we're completely unviable when maybe we may not be, but we're looking at it through the long lens. Is that too, I'm not saying we do need more money, but equally the depreciation question seems to just constantly drive us into the abyss.
Well, we've got assets that we can't sell, or pretty much all our assets we can't sell, and then a lot of them you wouldn't renew if they did fall due, or some you wouldn't renew if they did fall due. But it's the way they make you account, the way they've changed the depreciation. The auditors come in, and they say we might have a different unit rate here in Hay because we don't have any local quarries, so we use this basically a PSG material as our for our on our unsealed roads, but we have to get external valuers, as everyone has to, because they don't trust us to do our own valuations. So we have to get an external value. There's another cost there just to get them in, and then they say, right, well, they go back to Cordell's or whatever the book is, and they go and do some benchmarking around the place, and they say, well, this is what your roads units costs are, even though we might say, well, we don't really agree with that because we do it a bit differently here, but they'll say, no, that's the way it is. So, and then they use the accrual rather than the cash about what our actual cost is, and that's all snowballing, and that's only happened in the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, and
That's
it's happening everywhere, Dave. Like I said,
Yeah,
I know
no,
that.
I'm not just Have. I'm
Yeah.
just saying the way they're making us do it is really, really impacting the way that the depreciation looks. And I'm with Professor Drew. I think depreciation is important. Yes, it's a number on the page at a point in time, but it is a factor of that you need to fund some of it or most. We're saying 80% of it anyway, because you do have to renew your assets at some point in time. So it is an important number, and it can't be forgotten.
Yeah, but can I just cut in there one question? But when most of our let's call them discretionary assets, so not so much the roads, but all those nice halls over time they've been provided predominantly by grants. Some modern times it's 50-50 or whatever, but even in the old times, they were almost given to us by federal or state or. But now we're expected to put away money on when they finish, that we're going to actually purchase brand new ones. We're going to be back in the same position. So I'm just thinking that 80% might be a bit, could even be over the top too. But I know it just seems to be we try to convince all our farmers and communities that our rates are going on the roads. Our rates are barely not even touching our wages, and so what's actually funding it is the state and federal government. They're funding our capital, predominantly in the rural sector. Predominantly, where very few of us are putting our own hard-earned into capital projects because we can't even afford to do that. So I'm just
correct.
Yeah, so that's why I'm saying is there a sort of like I agree with the depreciation, but if you say, well, community, if those playgrounds aren't ready, aren't reach the end of their useful life, we haven't got a reserve here waiting for them. We're going to go with our cap out to the state government, where they probably come from to start with.
I agree 100%. That's why our renewal rate is down around 50% now at the moment because of that. But that's part of, I think, what Professor Drew talked about and we agree with is about that education of the community saying, hey, this is where we're at. We're okay. However, at some point in time, we're going to be struggling to renew some of these assets. So we're going to have to rely on grant funding, or we're going to have to make some tough decisions down the track. So I think it's about that messaging to the community, and that's what we're going to start trying to do a bit more around that. To let that, because you're right, we're going to have to rely on capital grants, and that we're never going to get away from that. I don't believe in the rural councils, but it's about how we message that and how we can best manage that, I think, Brad.
If I can just add to that about education, for my sins, I've had to do several special rate variations over the years. And the thing I always say to councillors, if you think a special rate variation is about getting the extra rates, you've got the wrong end of the stick. What it is you've finally got people's attention. Trust me, you really get their attention. And you've got an opportunity to talk to them for an hour when they're listening. And most people get to the end of an hour and go, oh, shoot, yeah, we're going to have to shovel up the extra cash. Last council I did, it was like 98% of people agreed with a massive tax hike, which is not good. I don't like doing it or anything else, but I do like the fact that people finally realise the typical Joe in the street thinks they hear that CPI figure, 3.8%. David's whinging he's got no money. He's going, David, you're incompetent. What are you doing? It's only 3.8%. We've got to educate them. And with that in mind, years ago, I started a YouTube channel, Professor Joseph Drew, and I'm not plugging it, I get nothing for it. But I put up videos there so councils could actually use them on their own website, because you can say until you're black, blue and pink in the face, no one will listen to you. Put up a video with me saying the same thing, they might listen. You never know your luck. The other thing I'd like to add to what David was saying, he was talking about the snowballing. Yes, depreciation is a problem, and it's not straightforward as some people think that it is, but there's also what I call the cupcake analogy. You eat one cupcake, you didn't turn obese. You eat one cupcake every week, you probably won't turn obese. You eat one cupcake every day for 50 years, like we've been doing with the rate cap, then you get obese. So it's tiny, tiny little increases. So I did an experiment a while back. I said to myself, what would happen if you were only 0.5% out between the rate cap and what it was and what it should have been? What would happen after 50 years? Well, not surprising, you'd be 26.5% behind in that 50th year of what you should have been, but you've also missed out on all the cash you missed out on in between for the last 50 years. To catch up on that missed out money, you would have to put your rates up 330%. Every little decision we make, every 0.5% we miss out on, accumulates, and if you're silly enough to do the experiment for 50 years like we've done, it doesn't end well. So that's my 2 cents. Any other questions? No. So while we're waiting for someone to come up with another question, the other thing that I'm always interested in is the financial assistance grants. So David used the correct word, horizontal fiscal equalisation. It's written in the legislation, section 6, subsection 3, read it for yourself. And it says that each council doing reasonable effort, doing things relatively efficiently, charging the fees you should be charging the rates you should be charging. It says in the legislation that you should be able to offer the same basic goods and services as other local governments throughout the state. Now, I say to you, go and have a drive down Sydney, Northern Beaches, places like that. Then pop over and drive through Hay, where David is, and tell me if the same local government goods and services are being offered in both places. Clearly, the horizontal fiscal equalisation objective of the legislation is not being met and hasn't been met for a long, long time. And what always bothers me about this is you councils in the bush go out, you're almost like mendicants with a begging bowl, as if they're doing you some great big favour to give you the money. A, the principle's in the legislation. B, most developed nations have this principle and do it properly, unlike ours. And C, most of the wealth of this income of this nation comes from us. It comes from the bush. Sorry, it's either agriculture or mining. That's what underwrites the whole Australian economy. Yes, it gets exported into the city and then it pays public servant wages that get recycled and end up in Bunnings and Woolworths and all these other things. But its ultimate source, most of it, is from us. So we're asking for a little bit of that back so that we can build the roads, so that we can get stuff to the ports and create more wealth for the country. So if you're sitting in a bush council thinking you should beg for more money, please don't. It's your entitlement, and it's actually in the nation's best interest. I often get a little bit flustered with this campaign to increase it to 1% of tax revenues. Yeah, wonderful if you can manage to convince the federal government to give us all extra money when they can't balance their own budget. That's never going to happen. The biggest problem is that we're not allocating the money according to the intent of the legislation. I know there's some other clauses in there causing problems, but the intent is quite clear. Horizontal fiscal equalisation, that's what they have in most countries. And it shouldn't be beyond us to manage that in Australia either. So please never feel like you have to beg for your legal and moral entitlement, because it is indeed an entitlement. Any other questions? Otherwise, we're going to knock off early. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. I hope it was informative. I certainly learnt a hell of a lot by listening to David, and now a lot of my numbers are making sense too. So thank you very much, David, and everyone that participated and listened. And don't forget, really, really important presentation, Friday the 15th of May at 11 o'clock, co-hosted with the University of New England in Armidale. If you're in any state, amalgamation is always looming. It's like the Grim Reaper with his sickle above your head all the time. And there's so much misinformation about what actually happened. Come and get the facts from a scholar, and also the facts from a mayor that had to go through that drama of amalgamation and the post-amalgamation story. So see you then.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Yeah.